Kayla called me out of the blue that Wednesday morning. Her tone was sweet, rehearsed, almost too pleasant. She said she and Brendan had a surprise for me. They wanted to take me on a little Mother's Day train ride through the countryside. A restored old locomotive with vintage cabins, soft music, and views of the cornfields outside Des Moines. I hadn't spent real time with them in months. Just short visits, quick exchanges, polite smiles. I had grown used to being left out of things. Holidays, birthdays, even Sunday dinners. But this call felt different. Kayla said Brendan thought it would be healing. That was the word she used. Healing. I was quiet for a beat. Then I thanked her. Not because I believed her, but because some part of me wanted to believe I was still part of something, still a mother, still wanted. Brendan didn't call me himself. He texted 2 words later that night. Can't wait. So I packed a light overnight bag, just in case. I brought my lavender scarf, the one my husband gave me on our last trip together before he passed. I packed ginger candies, a pen, and my leather journal. I hadn't written in weeks, but maybe I'd want to. They picked me up the next morning in Kayla's car. She had on a soft yellow dress and a scarf tied neatly around her neck like a flight attendant from an old movie. Brendan stayed on his phone most of the ride. He didn't speak much, just nodded when I asked about work. His eyes looked tired. The train station was small, tucked behind a shuttered feed store. It smelled of old wood and distant rain. There were only a few other passengers. A couple with a toddler. A man in overalls reading a paperback. Kayla handed me a thermos of chamomile tea and told me they needed to check something with the ticket agent. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and walked off with Brendan toward the far end of the platform. I sat on the bench watching the tracks shimmer in the sun. I waited. Then I waited longer. They didn't come back. That moment stretched. First 10 minutes, then 20. Then I walked toward where they had disappeared and found no one. Just a small folded note taped under the bench. It said, "If she still has her mind, she'll find her way back." And just like that, everything changed. The paper felt thin in my hand, too light to carry the weight of what it said. I stood there on the platform, the words settling into my chest like stones. If she still has her mind, she'll find her way back. I read it once, then again. My fingers tightened around it, but I didn't tear it. I folded it slowly like it was something sacred, not because it deserved reverence, but because it was proof that I hadn't imagined what they just did. The station was quiet. Only the soft screech of the train pulling away. My eyes scanned the lot, hoping their car was still there. It wasn't. Gone. Just like that. No phone. No purse. Just me, a thermos of tea and my scarf. I walked back inside the station. It was barely a room, 2 benches. A corkboard of faded flyers, a vending machine blinking red. The attendant had stepped out for lunch. There was no one to ask, no one to say it out loud to. I sat for a moment, then stood, then sat again. My knees had that buzz they get when I'm overwhelmed, not from walking, but from holding back emotion too long. I took a deep breath, not to calm down, but to anchor myself. I was not confused. I was not lost. I had been left. I walked outside. The sun had shifted. What was once warm now felt hollow. I followed the main road out of the station. Gravel turned to cracked sidewalk. Sidewalk turned to dirt. I walked. Miles blurred. Houses thinned out. The landscape stretched wide like the pages of a forgotten book. By the time the sun began to lower, my legs were trembling. I stopped near a faded green gas station that looked like it hadn't seen customers in hours. I leaned against the side wall, breathing through my nose, pressing my palm to my chest. A pickup truck pulled up to the pump. Out stepped a man in a flannel shirt and khakis. He moved slowly, like his joints were more memory than motion. He glanced my way, said nothing, just nodded, then filled his tank. When he walked past me to go inside, he paused. I could feel him watching me, but not out of pity, more like recognition. "You from around here?" He asked, his voice even. I didn't answer right away. I looked him in the eye and simply said, "I was left at the station." He nodded again. "I know the one. I used to work there before they cut hours. You need a ride somewhere?" I paused, then said yes. Not because I trusted him fully, but because I had no other choice left to trust. He opened the passenger door for me. I climbed in. He didn't ask questions, just turned on the engine and let the quiet fill the space between us. And for the first time since morning, I didn't feel invisible. I wasn't home yet, but I was no longer standing still. The truck moved steady along the narrow country road, the late afternoon light cutting long shadows across the dashboard. I leaned back in the seat, grateful for the warmth coming through the heater vents. My legs ached. My back throbbed from the hours of walking, but my mind was clearer than it had been in days. The man beside me said his name was Harold. He didn't offer more than that, and I didn't ask. There was something comforting in the silence between us, like we were two people who understood that sometimes words just clutter the truth. He didn't take the highway. Instead, he followed back roads lined with tall grass and old fence posts leaning like tired men. I noticed the way he drove carefully, like someone who knew every bend and bump from years of repetition. Every few minutes he glanced my way without turning his head, just enough to check if I was still breathing, still grounded. I told him my name eventually. Eleanor. He nodded like he already knew. By the time we reached his house, the sky had begun to dim. It was a modest place, tucked behind a row of bare oak trees. The siding was weathered, and the front steps creaked under my weight. He opened the door for me, let me sit in the old recliner near the window, and disappeared into the kitchen. When he returned, he handed me a cup of black coffee and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. I ate slowly. Every bite reminded me I hadn't eaten since morning. He didn't press for details. Just let me be. Later, he set up a cot in the spare room. No questions, no lectures, just kindness. I didn't sleep much that night. The room smelled faintly of cedar and dust. I lay there listening to the wind move through the trees outside. In the silence, my mind ran through the pieces again. The phone left behind the mumbled excuses, the paper note, the vanished car. There was no misunderstanding, no mix-up. This had been deliberate. The next morning, Harold drove me home. We didn't say much. He let the radio fill the space, soft guitar strumming beneath a steady voice, talking about snow in the forecast. When we pulled into my driveway, I hesitated before stepping out. The front door looked unchanged, but everything else felt off, like I was approaching a house I no longer fully belonged to. He didn't offer advice, just handed me a folded note with his phone number and said, "If you ever need someone to remember what really happened, I'm around." I nodded and stepped out. The house was quiet, too quiet. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The smell of my lavender diffuser had faded. The hallway mirror was smudged. The kitchen chairs were slightly moved, subtle, but enough to tell me someone had been there with intentions that had nothing to do with cleaning or kindness. I moved to my bedroom. One of the drawers was left cracked open. Inside, my file folders were rearranged. My power of attorney documents, health proxy forms, things that had been in place for years were now scattered. Some papers were missing. Some looked replaced. The safe in the closet was still locked. But I noticed scratches near the keyhole, not deep, but recent. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. The tea kettle whistled faintly from the kitchen. I hadn't turned it on. Something had shifted. I wasn't just left behind anymore. I had been targeted, and now I needed to decide whether to stay quiet or start preparing for what I suspected was coming. When Harold pulled into my driveway, the air felt different. It wasn't just the cool breeze or the overcast sky. It was something in my bones, something off. I thanked him again and stepped out of his old truck with a heavy silence between us. He didn't ask any questions, just a small nod before pulling away. The front porch light was on. That was strange. I always turned it off before I left. Inside, everything looked in place at first glance, but as I stepped in further, something started gnawing at me. The scent. It was too clean. A chemical lemon smell hung in the air. I hadn't used that brand of cleaner in years. My usual lavender oil was gone. My rug was slightly shifted the way it might be if someone were trying to tuck something back in place. I went to my study. The drawer I kept locked, the one holding legal documents and personal papers, had scratches near the keyhole. Barely visible, but I had seen enough in life to know what those meant. I opened it slowly. The documents were still there, at least the ones I expected. But the envelope labelled Property Deed, Westbrook House, had been moved. Not missing, just touched. A page bent back slightly. The seal was loosened, not broken. My heartbeat was calm, oddly steady. I placed the envelope on my desk and turned on my old desktop computer. My hands moved with muscle memory. I opened my banking app. Security questions, password 2-step verification. There it was. A new name listed under access permissions. Kayla M. Givens. Added 3 days ago. My fingers hovered over the mouse. I clicked into the recent activity section. There had been no transfers yet, just the permission granted. But that alone was enough. No call, no discussion, no signed letter from me. That name should not be there. I closed the laptop. I sat in the armchair near the window, the one I always used to read. The house was quiet, but I no longer felt at home. Not really. I thought about the way Kayla looked at me last week, the way she slowly placed her hand on my arm and smiled with too much sympathy. The kind of sympathy people offer just before they move you somewhere quiet, somewhere far away. I stayed there for nearly an hour, watching the wind play with the old maple outside. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I didn't even get angry. I just breathed. Deep, even breaths. Then I stood, went to the hall closet, and took down my old travel bag. I opened it slowly and placed inside a fresh notebook. A pen and the burner phone I bought last fall after Kayla mentioned switching me to a family plan. She thought I had thrown it away. I didn't. I zipped the bag and placed it under my bed. Tonight I would rest, but tomorrow I would begin. The next morning I rose early. The air was thick with a quiet tension like the sky before a storm. I made tea, sat in the same armchair by the window, and opened the fresh notebook I had placed in my travel bag the night before. Page 1, top corner, I wrote the date. Then I began. Not with long sentences, just facts. Short, direct, calm. Front porch light was on upon arrival. Drawer lock scratched. Envelope seal loosened. Bank account access changed. Kayla M. Givens added. Each entry had its own line. Clean. Unemotional. The way a nurse might chart a patient's vitals during a slow decline. An hour later, I tucked the notebook beneath a loose board in the hallway. I had used that hiding place before. No one knew it but me and Daniel years ago. I felt a flicker of warmth at the memory of his trust. Then it passed. That afternoon, Brendan called. His voice had the same worn-down softness I remembered from his childhood, like he was always apologizing in advance. He asked if I needed anything. I told him I was fine. He said he might drop by tomorrow just to check in. I didn't ask why. I thanked him and ended the call. The next day he arrived around 4, brought soup, sat awkwardly on the couch while I moved slowly around the kitchen. "I'm glad you're back safe, Mum," he said. Eyes lowered. I nodded, not meeting his gaze. "Thank you." He asked about the trip. I answered with vague words. Then I paused in the middle of putting spoons away and let the silence stretch. "Kayla's been worried about you," he said finally. I turned, looked at him with a softness I practiced earlier in the mirror. "She's kind," I said, then turned back to the drawer. He left after 20 minutes. I waited until the sound of his car faded, then went to the front door. I had placed a small sticker just behind the trim earlier that morning. It was peeled. Someone had checked the lock from outside. That night, Kayla came. She brought banana bread, still warm. I missed our chats. She smiled. I returned the smile slowly. So did I. We sat in the kitchen, shared small talk. She asked if I had remembered to take my vitamins. I nodded. Then, while I got us more tea, I watched from the corner of my eye. Her gaze lingered near the hallway where the coat closet stood, the same closet with the shelf above where I used to keep my travel documents. I dropped a spoon intentionally. As I bent to pick it up, I saw her rise slightly, step toward the hallway. She caught herself, laughed softly, and sat back down. Later that night, I opened the notebook again. Brendan visit. Soup. Eyes avoiding contact. Kayla visit. Looked toward coat closet. Distracted when alone. Then I closed the book and locked it away. I didn't sleep right away. I sat on the bed, breathing slow, listening to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Every detail mattered now, not because I was scared, but because I had finally decided I would not let this play run without a script. And this time I was writing it. The following morning I opened the closet and pulled out my old tape recorder. It was dusty, the kind you had to press both record and play at the same time to get it to run. I tested it with a fresh battery. It still worked. The soft click and mechanical hum felt oddly comforting. I left it charging in the corner beneath a folded towel in the guest room. The room Kayla often went into when she said she needed to help me sort papers. She always offered, always insisted she was helping. I had stopped believing that months ago. I moved more slowly those days. Not from weakness, but from design. I let cups rattle slightly in my hands. Let my thoughts pause in the middle of sentences. A furrowed brow here, a misplaced key there. Kayla noticed. "You've been a little forgetful lately, haven't you?" she said gently one afternoon while helping me refill the tea tin. I smiled faintly. "Have I?" She reached out, patted my hand. "We all do, Mum." That evening I made another entry in my notebook. Kayla mentioned memory again, gently framed, tested reaction. I started keeping a small calendar near the fridge. I wrote in appointments that never happened, meetings with people I hadn't spoken to in years. I left notes for myself in odd places. Once I stuck a reminder to turn off the stove on the bathroom mirror. Kayla saw it. 2 days later. She looked concerned, then composed. She took a photo of the note when she thought I wasn't looking. It was working. On Friday, I invited her over for tea. She arrived with a new planner for me, said it would help keep track of things. Inside was a pamphlet on support services for aging adults. I accepted it with a nod, then excused myself to the kitchen where the tape recorder was hidden beneath the stove drawer. Later, when I listened back, I heard her voice say, "Brendan and I just want her to be safe. Once we file, it's only temporary. We'll keep it quiet." File what I rewound the tape, played it again. Her tone was patient but purposeful. They were preparing something. I copied the audio onto a USB, labeled it June Visit, hid it inside an old sewing tin, the same tin she had given me 2 years ago on Christmas. The irony was not lost on me. That night I reread my entries. Patterns began to emerge. Each visit, each misplaced glance. Each time Kayla helped me with the mail or sorted my files. It all added up to something larger than suspicion. I wrote 3 more pages. I wrote down Brendan's odd silences, the changes in tone, the way he watched me now, not with affection, but with calculation. Then I turned off the lights and sat in the dark with only the sound of my own breath. I was no longer just reacting. I was preparing. Sunday afternoon, I invited Kayla for tea again. The sun poured through the curtains in the kitchen, warm and deceiving. I brewed chamomile, added a touch of lavender like she liked, and placed 2 ginger cookies on a porcelain plate I hadn't used in years. Everything felt measured. She came in cheerful, her voice syrupy sweet, the kind she used with her students. I listened carefully as we talked. My eyes never left her face. She commented on how peaceful the house felt, how nice it was that I still had a routine. She didn't know that I had already placed the recorder underneath the cushion of the armchair across from her, the one she always sat in. We talked about light things, Brendan's work, a student of hers who brought her a flower. Then she brought up the planner again. "I've started tracking a few things for you," she said, her fingers brushing the edge of her teacup. "Oh, just little thing. Doctors, renewals. Brendan and we might help with managing your appointments soon. There's a process for that." Her eyes never left the rim of her cup when she said it. "Sounds important," I said softly. She nodded, then like it was nothing, she said it. "We've already started filing for temporary guardianship. Just until things settle. It's what's best for you. I felt my heart slow, not race. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind. I gave a slow nod, reached for a tissue and pretended to dab my nose. She reached out and patted my hand again. Always the gentle authority. Later, when she left, I retrieved the recorder, played it back once, then twice. Her voice was clear, calm, as if discussing groceries. The words were there. We've already started filing. That night I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open, staring at the sentence I had just written. Then I did something I hadn't done in over 5 years. I picked up the phone and dialed Martha Reed's. She picked up after the second ring. Her voice was crisp, steady, just as I remembered from our yoga days. I reminded her who I was. She laughed, remembering the class where I fell out of tree pose and blamed the draft. But when I told her what had been happening, her tone changed. "You've got documents," she said, calm but direct. "I do. And recordings, songs." "Good. Do not confront them. We'll start with a freeze." The next day, I met Harold at the local diner. We hadn't spoken much since the day he drove me back from the station, but his presence had lingered. He listened without interrupting, then nodded once and pushed his plate aside. "I've got an extra lockbox at home, and a spare key." I handed him the USB drive, the notebook, and a sealed envelope with my most recent will. He placed them in his coat pocket without fanfare, then poured more coffee and talked about the weather. There was no drama, no raised voices, just two people moving pieces into place. And for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. I met Martha in a quiet back room at the senior legal center downtown. The building smelled of wood polish and old paper, familiar grounding. She wore her grey blazer and flats like armor, but when she saw me, her face softened. I handed her the USB, the notebook, and a printed copy of my will. She asked if I had a backup. I nodded. Harold had a second copy. We sat across from each other as she opened a legal pad and began to take notes. I told her everything. From the train station, the note, the missing paperwork, Kayla's calm tone when she spoke of guardianship. Martha barely blinked. She just wrote and underlined and nodded. "Coercive elder abuse," she said quietly. "It's more common than you think, especially with a well-meaning son and a strategic daughter-in-law." She showed me a legal form called a preemptive protective injunction. It was designed for cases where someone suspects others are planning to override their autonomy. It wouldn't accuse. It would simply freeze movement, prevent anyone from gaining control until a hearing was held. I signed it. Her hand firm on mine when I hesitated for a second. "We'll file this under seal. Brendan and Kayla won't even know it exists until they try to act." I thanked her. She waved it off and reminded me to keep my routines as usual, make them feel like nothing has changed. Back at Harold's, I stayed in the spare room that smelled faintly of pine soap and old clocks. He never asked questions, just made sure I had hot tea at night and oatmeal in the morning. He kept my box in his workroom. I noticed he'd added a new lock on the back door. One afternoon, while I was sitting on the porch, Brendan called. His voice was cheerful, breezy. He asked how I was feeling, if I needed anything. Then mentioned that Kayla had set up a meeting with someone at the bank to go over things. I told him I was grateful for their concern, that I trusted their judgment. He said, "That's good, Mum. We just want to make sure everything's in order." The next morning, Martha called to confirm the court date had been set quietly, privately, 3 weeks from now. Until then, I needed to stay quiet, play slow, appear uncertain when they asked, say thank you when they brought soup, let them believe the narrative they had written for me. So I did. I went to brunch with them that weekend, sat across from Kayla while she told Brendan about planning a beach trip. I laughed at her stories about her students and asked about the garden. Later that evening, I caught her near the hallway, glancing into my office again. I offered her tea. She declined, said she was tired. I smiled and let her go. That night I returned to Harold's and sat in silence. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad anymore. I was steady. The pieces were moving, and they didn't even know the board had changed. Brendan arrived just after noon, unannounced. I had just finished watering the porch ferns when I heard the familiar sound of his tires on the gravel. For a moment I considered not answering the door, but I dried my hands and opened it. He stood there in a crisp polo, holding a paper bag from the bakery I used to love. He smiled, but it was tight. His eyes flickered past me into the house. I stepped aside, letting him in. We sat in the sunroom where the light was soft and quiet. He started with small talk. How Harold was doing, if I had seen the hydrangeas starting to bloom. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He asked if I had been feeling forgetful lately, said Kayla mentioned I'd misplaced my keys a few times. I told him I had once, but I found them right after. He nodded like that proved something. Then he asked if I remembered the passcode to my online banking. I looked at him for a long time before answering. I said I had written it down somewhere, that I couldn't recall it off the top of my head. His expression didn't change, but he relaxed a little. He shifted topics again. Mentioned that Kayla had been in contact with someone from the bank about simplifying things, just in case I ever needed help managing day-to-day bills. His tone was casual, but the words were rehearsed. I asked him if everything was all right on his end. He hesitated, then said work had been unstable, that the market was shifting, and he wasn't sure how long his current position would last. There it was. The crack. I nodded slowly, said I understood, that these were difficult times. He smiled with a kind of grateful relief. Then he told me gently that he and Kayla were talking with a consultant about future planning, that some paperwork might come through in the mail and not to be alarmed. I asked if it was about my medical directives. He said yes, among other things. He said it was just so they could help me if anything happened. He used the phrase, act in your best interest. That was the moment everything became clear. Brendan, my son, had crossed the line. Not because he wanted to hurt me, but because he had convinced himself I needed protection. Or maybe he had convinced himself that I wouldn't notice. After he left, I sat for a while in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. What I felt was distance. A quiet, painful distance that had grown slowly over time, now finally complete. He wasn't visiting to check on me. He was measuring my capacity, calculating how soon they could move forward. Later that night, I texted Martha from Harold's phone, told her we needed to accelerate the timeline because Brendan had stopped being confused. Now he was complicit, and that changed everything. The next morning, I was already packed before the sun rose. I didn't bring much. Just one suitcase, my notebooks, a thumb drive, and a small canvas bag with my birth certificate, social security card, and the folder Martha had told me to safeguard. I left the rest. The house, the furniture, the porcelain, Kayla always hated all of it, stayed behind like an old shell I no longer needed. Harold picked me up just after 7. He didn't ask where we were going. He just nodded when I climbed into his truck and said the coffee was hot. We drove north, past the county line, into a quiet neighborhood where he had once lived with his late wife. His sister had kept the place for storage, and now it was mine, at least for a while. A small one-story house with faded curtains and creaky floors. But it was clean, safe, anonymous. The first thing I did after unlocking the door was place the notebook in the drawer beside the bed. I pressed the key into my palm before setting it in my purse. Then I sat down and called Martha. She had already prepared the court documents. A petition to freeze all legal changes related to my estate. An injunction against unauthorized guardianship petitions. A temporary block on Brendan and Kayla's access to any accounts or documents tied to my name. It sounded severe even to me. But then I remembered Brendan's face when he asked about my memory. I remembered Kayla's voice when she said I was just confused. I remembered the train station. Martha told me not to worry. The request would be filed quietly. There would be no hearing unless someone contested it. I gave her permission to file immediately. The rest of that day moved slowly. I walked through the small house, learning its sounds. I lit a candle in the kitchen. I folded the blanket at the foot of the guest bed. I didn't cry. In the evening, Harold brought dinner in Tupperware. He said nothing about the plan, only handed me a spoon and poured tea into a chipped mug. We sat across from each other, the radio humming low. It felt like winter inside a snow globe. Silent, but full. Before he left, I gave him a second thumb drive. It contained every recording, every document, every page of notes I had compiled since the day they left me at that station. If anything happens to me, I told him this goes to Martha. He nodded, said he understood. That night, for the first time in months, I slept through the night, not because I felt safe, but because I had stopped waiting for them to explain. Brendan and Kayla would move forward soon, I was sure of it. But so would I. And this time I wouldn't be the one caught off guard. The bank manager recognized Kayla right away. Brendan walked in behind her, calm and polished in his pressed shirt, his expression unreadable. They had made an appointment under my name. The plan, I would learn later, was simple. Brendan would say I was having trouble managing my affairs. Kayla would present a letter suggesting temporary guardianship, citing mental confusion and emotional distress. It wasn't a formal court order, but it was dressed up to sound close enough. What they didn't know was that Martha had already sent a certified letter to the same bank 3 days prior. It included a court injunction, a list of protected assets, and a formal notice that any attempt to alter, transfer, or access my accounts without my physical presence would be considered unlawful. So when Kayla asked to speak with the manager about accessing the joint account, she was met with a calm but firm response. The manager tapped the screen, looked up, and said the account had been temporarily frozen due to a legal notice from the primary account holder. Kayla smiled tightly. She tried to steer the conversation, hinting at family confusion, at my supposed cognitive decline, and the need for smooth transitions. But the manager didn't budge. He stated clearly that a court had issued protective measures, and that until further notice, no changes would be permitted without my explicit, in-person consent. Brendan stayed quiet, his jaw tense. Kayla pressed further, her voice rising ever so slightly. She even pulled out the letter they had prepared, placing it on the desk as if it were some kind of official decree. The manager only shook his head. There was nothing he could do. Security was called when Kayla refused to leave. Brendan muttered something about a misunderstanding. He tried to salvage the moment, but the damage had already been done. Their plan had failed before it even started. Back at Harold's house, I sat by the window as Martha texted me the update. They tried, she wrote, but the account is sealed tight. You're safe. I didn't smile, not because I wasn't relieved, but because I finally understood something deeper than fear. They hadn't just tried to take money. They had tried to erase the boundary between love and control, between concern and conquest, between family and manipulation. And now they had run into the one thing they didn't expect. Silence backed by law. I didn't tell them I moved out. I left the house early in the morning before the light changed the shape of the porch. I carried only a single bag. Harold drove me quietly and we didn't speak much. The silence felt clean, like a space where something had finally ended. Before I left, I slipped one envelope under the front door. Inside, I placed 3 things. The first was a printed copy of the audio recording, Kayla's voice, clear and cold, discussing temporary guardianship, like she was planning a grocery list. The second was a letter in my handwriting. Not bitter, just a quiet telling of what I saw, of what I heard, and of what I chose. I wrote, "The moment you decided I couldn't make decisions, I made one." And the third was a single page from my old yoga journal. It had a quote I underlined years ago. "When they believe you're weak, they forget you still remember." I left that as my final word. There was no announcement, no public scene, no confrontation in the living room. Only silence and a sealed letter. At Harold's place, I started building small routines again. I led quiet breathing sessions for 2 women from the nearby church. I kept the windows open. The air smelled different here. Lighter. Martha sent word that the court approved a full block on any financial movement from my old accounts. She said I could now begin the process of reassigning everything to my name alone again. But I told her no. Instead, I directed everything into a new foundation, a quiet one, for women over 60 who needed help reclaiming control of their money, their voice, their breath. I didn't need revenge. I needed peace. And peace came not with an apology, but with the decision to no longer wait for one. If you've ever felt like your silence was mistaken for weakness, or if someone close tried to erase your power behind a smile, then I hope this story reminded you that dignity doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just leaves the door gently and never returns. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your stories, or just a quiet word. You're not alone, and your voice, even in silence, still matters.